My name is Alex, and I've been working security for the past 8 years. I've seen my share of weird stuff. People trying to break in, employees staying way too late, the occasional homeless person looking for shelter. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I discovered during my rounds at the Meridian Corporate Center last winter. I still get chills thinking about it, and honestly, I'm not sure I'll ever feel safe in any building again. The Meridian Corporate Center is one of those typical glass and steel office buildings downtown, 12 floors, mostly accounting firms, law offices, and a few tech startups. I'd been working the night shift there for about 3 years, 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 5 nights a week. The building was usually completely empty by the time I started my shift, except for the occasional workaholic pulling an all-nighter. My routine was simple. Walk the floors every 2 hours, check the doors, make sure all the windows were secure, and spend the rest of my time monitoring the security cameras from the lobby desk. It started with small things that I initially dismissed. Around Christmas time, I began noticing that items in certain offices would be slightly moved between my rounds. A coffee mug would be on the opposite side of a desk. Papers would be shuffled differently, or a chair would be turned at an odd angle. At first, I figured it was just the cleaning crew being careless, even though they were supposed to finish their work before I arrived. When I mentioned it to my supervisor, he just shrugged and said the building settles at night. Things shift around. I accepted that explanation because, honestly, what else could it be? But then the food started disappearing. Employees would leave snacks in their desk drawers or small fridges scattered throughout the building. Nothing expensive, just crackers, granola bars, leftover sandwiches. I started getting complaints from office workers saying their food was going missing, and they suspected the cleaning crew. Security cameras in the hallways showed nothing unusual, just me doing my rounds like clockwork. I even stayed up later a few nights, watching the monitors more carefully. But I never saw anyone who shouldn't be there. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night in January. I was doing my 3 a.m. round on the 7th floor when I heard something that made my blood run cold, the faint sound of someone typing. It was coming from the direction of Henderson & Associates, a small accounting firm that had been closed for nearly a month due to some kind of audit investigation. I stood perfectly still in the hallway, listening. The typing was rhythmic, consistent, definitely coming from inside their locked office suite. I radioed building management immediately, but of course, no one was available at 3 a.m. except an answering service. I called the police, but they said without evidence of a break-in. They couldn't respond immediately. They'd send an officer when one became available. So I did what any security guard would do. I used my master key and went in to investigate. The Henderson & Associates office was dark, except for the glow of a computer monitor in one of the back cubicles. As I got closer, I could see someone hunched over a keyboard, typing away like they owned the place. My heart was pounding as I approached. Flashlight ready. When I called out, "Hey, you're not supposed to be here," the person turned around, and I found myself face to face with a man I'd never seen before. Probably in his 40s. Wearing a wrinkled business shirt and looking like he'd been living rough for weeks. He didn't seem surprised to see me at all. In fact, he smiled and said, "Oh, you must be Alex. I've been watching you make your rounds. Very punctual." That's when my blood turned to ice. This guy had been watching me, knew my name, knew my schedule. He stood up slowly, hands visible, clearly trying not to spook me, and explained that he'd been staying in the building for the past few months. He'd lost his job, then his apartment, and had nowhere else to go. He'd figured out how to access the building through a maintenance entrance in the parking garage that wasn't properly secured. But here's where it gets really disturbing. He didn't just find some corner to sleep in. This guy had turned the Henderson and Associates office into his personal living space. He showed me how he'd been sleeping under desks during the day when people were around, then coming out at night to use the computers, eat food from various offices, and even shower in the executive bathroom that had a private washroom. He'd been living like a ghost in the walls of this building, invisible to everyone except the security cameras, and he'd figured out their blind spots. The worst part was when he started showing me what he'd been doing on the computers. He'd been accessing employee files, reading through confidential documents, going through people's emails. He knew intimate details about the lives of dozens of people who worked in that building, their salaries, their personal problems, their medical information, their family situations. He'd been playing some kind of sick game, learning everything he could about these people who walked above him every day, completely unaware that someone was cataloging their entire lives. He'd even been taking photos. He showed me a folder on the computer filled with pictures he'd taken of employees throughout the building. People working late, people in compromising situations during office parties, people in the bathrooms and changing areas. He'd somehow gotten access to cameras I didn't even know existed, hidden security feeds that were supposed to be restricted to building management only. This man had been watching everyone, recording everything, for months. When I asked him why he was telling me all this instead of running, he said something that still gives me nightmares. "Because you're not the first security guard I've met here, Alex. You're just the first one who found me." He explained that my predecessor, a guy named Rick, who'd supposedly quit suddenly 6 months earlier, had actually discovered him too. But Rick had tried to handle it quietly, tried to cut some kind of deal to avoid involving the police. Rick had been bringing him food, letting him stay in exchange for information about employees that Rick could use for his own purposes. The man showed me Rick's security reports from those last few weeks. Reports I'd never seen because they'd been filed in a way that bypassed normal channels. Rick had been blackmailing employees based on information this guy provided. They'd been working together, and when Rick got too greedy and started demanding more money from their victims, he disappeared. The homeless man claimed he didn't know what happened to Rick, but the way he said it made it clear that Rick's disappearance wasn't voluntary. I immediately called the police again, this time making it clear that I had an intruder in custody and evidence of potential criminal activity. While we waited for them to arrive, the man kept talking, describing in detail how he'd watched me work, how he'd learned my habits, how he knew exactly when I'd be in each part of the building. He'd been studying me, just like he'd studied everyone else. And I realized that if he'd wanted to hurt me, he could have done it dozens of times over the past few months when I was completely alone and vulnerable. The police arrived and arrested him, and over the next few days, the full scope of what had been happening came to light. Building management found evidence that he'd been accessing restricted areas throughout the building, not just Henderson and Associates. He'd been in the server rooms, the executive offices, even the building's main security office. He'd been copying files, documenting building security procedures, and had enough information to potentially compromise every business in that building. They found Rick's body 3 weeks later in a storage room in the building's sub-basement, a room that wasn't on any of the building plans and had been sealed off during renovations years earlier. The homeless man had apparently killed him when Rick threatened to expose their arrangement to building management. Rick had been down there for months, and none of us had any idea. The building was shut down for 2 weeks while police and federal investigators went through everything. They found hidden cameras, listening devices, and evidence that this had been going on in other buildings downtown as well. This wasn't just one desperate homeless man. This was part of a larger operation involving corporate espionage and identity theft that had been running for years. I quit that job the day they reopened the building. I couldn't walk those halls anymore without imagining eyes watching me from hidden places, without wondering who else might be living in the walls, learning my routines, planning something horrible. Even now, working security at a different location, I check every corner twice. I test every door that should be locked. And I never, ever assume that I'm truly alone in a building, no matter how empty it seems. Because sometimes the monsters aren't trying to break in. Sometimes they're already inside, watching and waiting, learning everything about you while you go about your life completely unaware that you're being hunted. My name is Kara, and I've been working as an ICU nurse for 12 years. I've seen people die, I've seen miracles happen, and I've learned to accept that medicine doesn't have all the answers. But what happened to me during my night shifts at St. Catherine's Hospital last fall challenged everything I thought I knew about life, death, and what lies between them. I'm sharing this story because I need people to understand that sometimes patients know things they shouldn't know. And sometimes we need to listen to them even when what they're saying seems impossible. It started in October when we admitted a patient I'll call Mr. Henley to our ICU. He was 83 years old, brought in after suffering a massive stroke that left him mostly unresponsive. According to his medical records, the stroke had damaged the areas of his brain responsible for speech and motor function. His family had been told that even if he survived, he would likely remain in a vegetative state for the rest of his life. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, could barely open his eyes. For all practical purposes, Mr. Henley was a shell of his former self, kept alive by machines and the hope that somehow, some way, there might be some spark of consciousness still flickering inside. I worked the night shift in the ICU, 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., and Mr. Henley was assigned to my section. During those first few weeks, he was exactly what you'd expect from someone in his condition, completely unresponsive, requiring total care, showing no signs of awareness. His vital signs were stable but weak, and the doctors had pretty much written him off as a long-term care case, who would eventually be transferred to a nursing facility when his family accepted that he wasn't going to recover. The first time I heard him speak, I thought I was losing my mind. It was around 2 a.m. on a Thursday night in late October, and I was doing my routine checks on all my patients. The ICU was quieter than usual. Most of our patients were stable, and my only real concern was a car accident victim who was recovering from emergency surgery. As I approached Mr. Henley's bed to check his IV and adjust his position to prevent bed sores, I heard a weak voice whisper, "The woman in bed 12 is going to die tonight." I spun around, thinking one of my other patients had somehow gotten out of bed. But everyone was exactly where they were supposed to be. Then I looked down at Mr. Henley, and his eyes were open, staring directly at me with a clarity that shouldn't have been possible given his brain damage. His lips barely moved as he whispered again, "Check on her now. She doesn't have long." Bed 12 was Mrs. Patterson, a 67-year-old woman who'd been admitted 3 days earlier for what should have been routine gallbladder surgery. Her recovery had been progressing normally, and she was actually scheduled to be transferred out of the ICU the next morning. But when I checked on her, something was wrong. Her skin was pale and clammy, her breathing was shallow, and her heart rate was elevated. I immediately called for the attending physician, and within an hour, Mrs. Patterson had gone into septic shock from a post-surgical infection that hadn't shown up in any of her previous tests. Despite our best efforts, Mrs. Patterson died at 4:17 a.m., exactly as Mr. Henley had predicted. When I returned to his bedside after we'd lost her, his eyes were closed again, and he appeared to be back in his unresponsive state. I tried talking to him, asking him how he'd known about Mrs. Patterson, but he gave no indication that he could hear me or that he'd spoken at all. I didn't mention the incident to anyone. Who would believe me? A brain-damaged stroke patient with documented speech impairment had somehow predicted another patient's death hours before it happened. I convinced myself that it had been a coincidence, that maybe I'd imagined the whole conversation, that the stress of losing a patient was making me paranoid and irrational. But it happened again 2 weeks later. This time, Mr. Henley whispered to me about a young man in bed 7 who was going to stop breathing at sunrise. Bed 7 was occupied by Jake Morrison, a 24-year-old who'd been in a motorcycle accident. He was in serious but stable condition, recovering from surgery to repair internal injuries. There was no medical reason to expect any complications, and he'd been showing steady improvement. At 6:43 a.m., just as the sun was coming up and my shift was almost over, Jake Morrison went into cardiac arrest. We managed to resuscitate him, but his brain had been without oxygen for several minutes, and he never fully recovered. He died 3 days later when his family made the decision to remove life support. This time, I couldn't dismiss it as coincidence. I started paying closer attention to Mr. Henley, watching for any signs that he was more aware than his medical condition should allow. During the day shifts, he remained completely unresponsive. Other nurses reported no unusual behavior, no signs of consciousness, nothing that would suggest he was anything more than a vegetative patient requiring basic care. But during my night shifts, especially in those dark hours between 2 and 4 a.m., when the hospital felt most like a tomb, Mr. Henley would sometimes open his eyes and speak. Always in that same weak whisper, always with information he couldn't possibly know. He told me about Mrs. Chen in bed 3, who would have a seizure that would leave her permanently disabled. He warned me about Mr. Rodriguez in bed 15, who would develop a blood clot that would require emergency surgery. He predicted that the elderly man in bed 9 would pass away peacefully in his sleep, surrounded by family members who would arrive just in time to say goodbye. Every single prediction came true, down to the smallest details. Mrs. Chen's seizure happened exactly when he said it would, during the shift change when the day nurse was getting briefed on her condition. Mr. Eberhard Rodriguez's blood clot was discovered during a routine ultrasound that had been ordered based on my gut feeling that something wasn't right. The elderly man's family arrived from out of state just hours before he passed, even though his condition had been stable for days. The most disturbing part wasn't just that Mr. Henley's predictions were accurate. It was how specific they were. He didn't just say someone would die. He would describe exactly how it would happen, what complications would arise, and sometimes even what the person's final words would be. He told me that Mrs. Patterson had called out for her deceased husband's name as she lost consciousness. He said that Jake Morrison had asked the paramedics if his motorcycle was okay right before his heart stopped. These were details that I later confirmed with other staff members who had been present during those critical moments. I started documenting everything in a private journal, keeping track of Mr. Henley's predictions and their outcomes. Over the course of 3 months, he made 17 specific predictions about patient outcomes, and 16 of them came true exactly as he described. The only prediction that didn't come true was about a young woman who was supposed to have complications during a routine procedure, but her surgery was postponed at the last minute due to a scheduling conflict. I also started researching Mr. Henley's background, trying to understand who he had been before the stroke. I learned that he had been a hospital administrator for over 40 years, working at various medical facilities throughout the state. He had spent his entire career around sick and dying people, witnessing thousands of medical crises and outcomes. Maybe somehow, His brain had processed patterns and warning signs that the rest of us missed, even in his damaged state. But that explanation fell apart when he started telling me about things that were happening outside the ICU, in parts of the hospital he couldn't possibly observe. He warned me about a fire that would break out in the cafeteria kitchen during the dinner shift. He described a water pipe that would burst in the emergency department, flooding 2 examination rooms. He even predicted that one of our security guards would have a heart attack in the parking lot during his rounds. All of these events happened exactly as he described, and there was no way Mr. Henley could have had any knowledge about them. He was bedridden, connected to monitors and machines, with no access to information beyond what was happening directly around his bed. Yet somehow, he was aware of events throughout the entire hospital, as if he was connected to some kind of network that allowed him to sense danger and death wherever they might occur. The final straw came in January, when Mr. Henley looked at me with those impossibly clear eyes and whispered, "Your patient in bed 4 is going to code in 20 minutes. But this time, you won't be able to save him. And his death will be different from the others. This one will see me watching him, and he'll try to warn you about what's coming next." Bed 4 was occupied by a middle-aged man recovering from heart surgery. His condition had been improving steadily, and there were no indications of any problems. But exactly 20 minutes later, his monitors started alarming, and despite our immediate response, we couldn't stabilize him. As he was losing consciousness, he grabbed my arm and said, "The old man in bed 1, he's not what you think he is. He's collecting us, and you're helping him do it." Mr. Henley died 3 days later, quietly and without any final predictions. His death was listed as complications from his original stroke, but I knew better. He had served whatever purpose he'd been meant to serve, and now it was time for him to move on. I transferred to a different department the following week because I couldn't continue working in that ICU, knowing that I had somehow been complicit in something I didn't understand. I still don't know what Mr. Henley was or how he knew the things he knew. Maybe he was just an ordinary man whose brain damage had unlocked some kind of supernatural awareness. Maybe he was something else entirely. Something that had been waiting in that hospital for the right opportunity to manifest. All I know is that death has a voice, and sometimes it speaks through the people we least expect to hear from, warning us about things we can't change but need to witness. My name is Adonis, and I've been working as a janitor at Memorial General Hospital for 6 years now. I take pride in my work. Keeping a hospital clean isn't just about appearances. It's about saving lives by preventing infections and maintaining a safe environment for patients and staff. I work the night shift, 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., because that's when most of the deep cleaning happens, when the hallways are empty and I can really focus on doing the job right. I've always been comfortable working alone in that massive building, even in the basement levels where most people never go. At least, I was comfortable until I discovered what was happening in the morgue after hours. The basement of Memorial General is like a small city underneath the main hospital. There are storage rooms, mechanical areas, the laundry facility, employee break rooms, and of course, the morgue and pathology department. Most night shift workers avoid the basement if they can help it. It's cold, poorly lit, and has that institutional smell that seems to seep into your clothes and follow you home. But I've never been bothered by places like that. Dead people can't hurt you, and the living ones are usually too busy with their own problems to cause trouble for a janitor just trying to do his job. My routine in the basement was always the same. I'd start with the employee areas, break rooms, locker rooms, administrative offices. Then I'd work my way through the storage and mechanical rooms, making sure everything was clean and properly maintained. The morgue and pathology areas were always saved for last because they required special cleaning procedures and different equipment. I had keys to most areas, but the morgue itself was supposed to be locked and off limits unless there was a specific request from the pathology department. The first time I noticed something was wrong, it was about 4 months ago. I was cleaning the hallway outside the morgue around 3 a.m. when I heard sounds coming from inside. Voices, movement, the distinct noise of equipment being used. This struck me as odd because the pathology department didn't normally work night shifts, except for emergencies, and I hadn't received any notifications about after-hours activities that would require additional cleaning support. I knocked on the door, thinking maybe there had been some kind of emergency autopsy that I should know about so I could prepare for extra cleaning afterward. The sound stopped immediately, and after a few minutes, a man in scrubs opened the door. I'd never seen him before, which was unusual since I'd been working there for years and knew most of the medical staff by sight. He was probably in his 50s, with gray hair and the kind of confident demeanor you'd expect from a doctor. But something about his eyes made me uncomfortable. He told me they were conducting a special procedure and that my services wouldn't be needed that night. He seemed nervous, kept looking back into the morgue, and was obviously eager to get rid of me. I apologized for the interruption and went about my other duties, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man hadn't been wearing a hospital ID badge, and when I checked the scheduling system later, there were no after-hours procedures listed for the pathology department. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to activity in the basement during my shifts. About twice a week, usually between 2 and 4 a.m., I would notice lights on in the morgue and hear the sounds of people working inside. I began documenting these incidents in my personal log, noting dates, times, and any details I could observe without being intrusive. I also started asking other night shift workers if they'd seen any unfamiliar medical staff in the basement, but most of them avoided that area entirely and had nothing to report. The breakthrough came about 6 weeks later, when I was cleaning a storage room adjacent to the morgue. The walls in that old building are thin, and I could hear voices clearly through the ventilation system. What I heard made my blood run cold. They were discussing modifications to bodies, talking about removing organs and replacing them with different ones, and mentioning payments from people who weren't hospital staff or legitimate medical researchers. I realized I was listening to some kind of illegal organ harvesting operation, but I couldn't figure out how they were getting away with it. The morgue had security cameras, strict access controls, and detailed logging systems for every body that came and went. Then I heard something that explained everything. They were only working on bodies that were scheduled for cremation, bodies whose families had requested immediate disposal without viewing or additional services. These were people who would never be seen again after entering the morgue, making them perfect targets for unauthorized procedures. I knew I had to document what was happening, but I also knew I needed concrete evidence before going to the authorities. Using my master keys, I started accessing the morgue during my regular cleaning hours when it was supposed to be empty. What I found there still gives me nightmares. Bodies that should have been intact were showing signs of surgical procedures that weren't documented anywhere in their official records. Incisions that had been carefully sutured, organs removed and replaced with different ones. And in some cases, bodies that had been partially dismantled and reconstructed. The most disturbing discovery was a logbook hidden in one of the storage cabinets. It contained detailed records of the unauthorized procedures, including information about where the harvested organs were being sold and how much money was changing hands. The operation had been going on for over 2 years, and they had processed hundreds of bodies. The financial records showed payments to several people who I recognized as hospital employees, including some administrative staff who had access to scheduling and record-keeping systems. But the worst part was discovering that they weren't just harvesting organs from people who were already dead. Some of the entries in the logbook described procedures performed on people who were still alive, but had been declared dead prematurely. Homeless people who had died alone, elderly patients with no family, people whose deaths wouldn't be closely scrutinized or investigated. These victims had been kept alive just long enough to harvest their organs while they were still fresh, then killed and processed like the other bodies. I realized that my discovery had put me in serious danger. These people were murderers, not just thieves. And they had been operating under everyone's noses for years. I started carrying a small camera with me during my cleaning rounds, documenting everything I could find without disturbing the evidence too much. I photographed the unauthorized incisions, the hidden records, and even managed to get pictures of some of the people involved during their late-night activities. The most terrifying moment came when I realized they knew I was onto them. I had been careful, but apparently not careful enough. One night, as I was cleaning near the morgue, the same gray-haired man who had dismissed me weeks earlier approached me in the hallway. He was friendly, almost too friendly, asking about my family, my living situation, whether I had any health problems that required regular medical attention. The conversation felt like a threat disguised as small talk, and I understood that I was being evaluated as a potential victim. From that point on, I changed my entire routine. I started cleaning the basement areas earlier in my shift. When other night staff were still around, I made sure to check in regularly with security guards and other workers, establishing a clear timeline of my activities and whereabouts. I also started carrying a personal alarm and made sure my family knew exactly when my shift started and ended so they would notice immediately if I didn't come home. I spent weeks agonizing over what to do with the evidence I had gathered. I knew that going to hospital administration would be useless since some of their own employees were involved. The local police might not take the allegations seriously without more concrete proof. And I was afraid that alerting the wrong people would just give the criminals time to cover their tracks and disappear. Finally, I decided to contact the FBI directly. I compiled all of my documentation, photographs, and recordings into a comprehensive report and submitted it through their anonymous tip line. Within 2 weeks, federal agents had launched a full investigation of the hospital's morgue and pathology department. The raid happened during one of their late-night sessions, and they arrested 5 people, including 2 doctors, a pathology technician, and 2 administrative staff members. The investigation revealed that the organ harvesting ring had connections to several other hospitals throughout the state, and that they had been selling organs to wealthy patients who couldn't wait for legitimate transplants. The estimated value of the stolen organs was over $3 million, and the investigation led to additional arrests and prosecutions that dismantled the entire network. I continued working at Memorial General for a few months after the arrests. But I couldn't feel comfortable in that basement anymore. Every time I walked past the morgue, I thought about all the people who had been violated after death, all the families who never knew that their loved ones had been desecrated for profit. I eventually transferred to a different hospital across town, where I still work as a night janitor. The experience taught me that evil can hide anywhere, even in places that are supposed to be dedicated to healing and helping people. It also showed me that sometimes ordinary people have to take extraordinary risks to stop terrible things from happening. I'm sharing this story because I want people to know that if you see something wrong, if you suspect that crimes are being committed, you have a responsibility to act, even if it's dangerous or scary. The dead can't speak for themselves, but sometimes those of us who work in the shadows can be their voice, making sure that justice is served and that the people who prey on the helpless are held accountable for their actions. My name is Bailey, and until 6 months ago, I worked the night shift at the Pine Valley Motor Lodge, a small roadside motel about 20 miles outside of town. It's the kind of place that caters to long-haul truckers, traveling salespeople, and people who need a cheap room for the night without asking too many questions. I took the job right out of high school because it paid decent money for someone with no experience, and the night shift meant I could take college classes during the day. I thought the worst thing I'd have to deal with would be drunk guests, or maybe the occasional person trying to skip out on their bill. I never imagined I'd stumble into something that would make me question everything I thought I knew about the people around me. The Pine Valley Motor Lodge has 32 rooms arranged in a horseshoe shape around a small parking lot. There's an office at the front where I worked, a small laundry room, and a vending machine area. Most nights were pretty quiet, maybe 5 or 6 occupied rooms during the week, a few more on weekends. The clientele was mostly predictable. Tired drivers looking for a few hours of sleep, couples having affairs, and the occasional family traveling on a tight budget. I'd been working there for about 8 months when I first encountered the guest in room 18. His name was registered as David Walsh, and he'd been staying at the motel for almost 3 weeks when I started my job. The day shift clerk, Mrs. Henderson, told me that Mr. Walsh was a regular customer who paid cash for a week at a time and kept to himself. He drove a white panel van with no windows in the back, parked it directly in front of his room, and rarely left the property except to buy supplies from the convenience store across the street. She described him as polite but distant, the kind of guest who never caused problems and always paid on time. During my first few weeks on the night shift, I barely saw Mr. Walsh at all. His room was at the far end of the motel, away from the office, and he seemed to keep unusual hours that didn't coincide with my brief walks around the property to check on things. The only signs that he was there were his van in the parking space and the occasional light visible through the heavy curtains he kept drawn across his window. Mrs. Henderson had mentioned that he always requested the same room when it was available, and that he'd been coming to the motel on and off for almost 2 years. The first thing that struck me as odd was the smell. About a month into my employment, I noticed a strange odor in the area around room 18. It wasn't exactly unpleasant, but it was medicinal, like the scent of antiseptic or cleaning chemicals mixed with something else I couldn't identify. When I mentioned it to Mrs. Henderson, she said she'd noticed it too, but figured Mr. Walsh might have some kind of medical condition that required special treatments or medications. We decided not to investigate further since he was paying his bills and not bothering other guests. The second unusual thing was the deliveries. Every few days, usually during my shift, various delivery trucks would arrive with packages addressed to room 18. The drivers would always ask me to sign for the deliveries, and I'd walk them over to Mr. Walsh's room personally. The packages came from medical supply companies, specialty food distributors, and occasionally from places I'd never heard of with no return address. Mr. Walsh would always answer the door quickly, as if he'd been watching for the delivery, take the packages with a quiet, "Thank you," then close the door immediately. What really caught my attention was the size and frequency of the food deliveries. Mr. Walsh was ordering enough groceries to feed a family of 6 or 7 people, but as far as anyone knew, he was staying alone. When I asked him about it one night while delivering a particularly large order of fresh produce and meat, he explained that he had dietary restrictions and preferred to prepare his own meals rather than eat at restaurants. It was a reasonable explanation, but something about the way he said it felt rehearsed, like he'd been expecting the question and had prepared his answer in advance. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to the activity around room 18. Despite the large food orders, I never saw any trash bags outside his room on collection days. Other guests would leave their garbage by their doors for the cleaning service to pick up. but room 18 never had any visible waste. This seemed impossible given the amount of food being delivered, and I started to wonder if Mr. Walsh was somehow disposing of his trash elsewhere or if something else was going on. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night in November, when I was doing my routine security walk around the property. As I passed behind room 18, I noticed that one of the bathroom windows was slightly cracked open, presumably for ventilation. Through the gap, I could hear voices, multiple voices, coming from inside the room. There were at least 3 or 4 different people talking, including what sounded like a woman and possibly a child. The conversation was too muffled for me to make out specific words, but it was clear that Mr. Walsh was not alone in that room. This discovery completely changed my perspective on the situation. Mr. Walsh had been lying about being a single occupant, which violated our occupancy policies and potentially created safety issues if the room was overcrowded. But more concerning was the question of who these other people were and why Mr. Walsh was hiding their presence. The large food orders suddenly made sense, but it raised new questions about why these people were staying in a single motel room for weeks at a time without ever being seen. I decided to document what I was observing before taking any action. Over the next several nights, I carefully noted the times when I heard multiple voices, when lights were on in the room, and when the white van left or returned to the parking space. I discovered that there were definitely at least 4 people staying in room 18, and that they kept very irregular schedules. Sometimes the voices would be active during my entire shift. Other times the room would be completely silent for hours at a time. The most disturbing discovery came when I started recognizing some of the voices. One of them belonged to a young woman who sounded distressed, often crying or speaking in what seemed like pleading tones. Another voice belonged to what was clearly a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old, who would sometimes be heard crying during the early morning hours. The adult male voices, including Mr. Walsh's, were usually calm and controlling, giving instructions or making demands that the woman and child seemed to be responding to with fear. I realized I was potentially witnessing some kind of human trafficking situation. The secretive behavior, the hidden occupants, the controlling dynamics I was hearing through the window. It all pointed to people being held against their will. But I also knew I needed to be careful about how I handled the situation. If I was wrong, I could lose my job and face legal consequences for violating a guest's privacy. If I was right, alerting the wrong people could put the victims in even greater danger. I started researching missing persons reports online, looking for anyone who might match the voices I was hearing from room 18. What I found made my stomach turn. There had been several disappearances in the area over the past 2 years, women and children who had vanished without a trace, often from vulnerable situations like homeless shelters, bus stations, or while hitchhiking. The timeline coincided perfectly with Mr. Walsh's history as a regular guest at the motel, and I began to suspect that room 18 was being used as some kind of way station for moving victims from one location to another. The situation escalated when I started receiving phone calls during my shift from people asking if I'd seen specific missing persons. Family members, private investigators, even law enforcement officers would call with descriptions of people they were looking for. And several of those descriptions matched the voices I'd been hearing from room 18. When I asked my supervisor about these calls, she told me they'd been receiving similar inquiries for months. But that motel policy was to not provide information about guests without a warrant. I couldn't remain silent any longer. Using the anonymous tip line, I contacted the state police and reported my suspicions about the activities in room 18. I provided them with all of my documentation, including the dates and times when I'd heard multiple voices, the pattern of deliveries, and the connection to missing persons reports. I also gave them copies of Mr. Walsh's registration information and vehicle details. The raid happened 3 nights later during my shift. I watched from the office as unmarked police cars surrounded room 18 and officers moved into position. When they breached the door, they found Mr. Walsh and 3 victims who had been reported missing over the past 6 months. A 22-year-old woman, her 4-year-old daughter, and a teenage girl who had disappeared from a bus station in a neighboring state. The investigation revealed that Mr. Walsh was part of a larger trafficking network that used small motels like ours to move victims between locations. Room 18 had been specifically chosen because it was isolated from the main office and had rear access that allowed people to be moved in and out without being seen by staff or other guests. The victims were kept sedated most of the time, which explained the medical supply deliveries, and were only conscious during transport or when buyers came to inspect them. I quit my job at the Pine Valley Motor Lodge the day after the arrests. I couldn't continue working there, knowing what had been happening right under my nose for months. And I couldn't stop thinking about all the other victims who might have passed through that room before I started paying attention. The experience taught me that evil often hides in plain sight, disguised as ordinary people doing ordinary things, and that sometimes the only thing standing between victims and rescue is someone who's willing to pay attention and take action when something doesn't seem right. My name is Caden, and I've been working the graveyard shift at Millbrook Textile Manufacturing for 7 years now. It's not glamorous work, operating industrial weaving machines that produce fabric for clothing companies, but it pays well, and the night shift bonus helps support my family. I've always been a practical guy, the kind of person who believes in hard work, science, and things that make logical sense. I don't read horoscopes, I don't believe in ghosts, and I've never put much stock in superstitions or folklore. At least, I didn't until I started working with Machine 7, a piece of equipment that somehow knew about accidents before they happened and tried to warn us through the fabric it produced. Millbrook Textile has been operating in our town for over 60 years, producing various types of fabric in a facility that runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The night shift crew consists of about 12 people scattered across the massive factory floor, each responsible for monitoring and maintaining several weaving machines. These machines are computer-controlled now, much more sophisticated than the old mechanical looms, but they still require constant attention to prevent jams, maintain quality, and keep production on schedule. Machine 7 was installed about 3 years ago as part of a modernization program, replacing an older unit that had been in service since the 1980s. It was state-of-the-art equipment, capable of producing complex patterns and switching between different fabric types with minimal downtime. The machine was assigned to my section because I had the most experience with the new computerized systems, and management wanted to ensure maximum productivity from their expensive investment. For the first 6 months, Machine 7 operated exactly as expected. It produced high-quality fabric, required minimal maintenance, and helped increase our department's output significantly. The computer system that controlled the weaving patterns was reliable and precise, creating exactly what was programmed into it without deviation or error. I had no complaints about the equipment and actually preferred working with it over the older, more temperamental machines in other parts of the factory. The first strange incident occurred in March of last year. I was running a standard order for cotton blend fabric when I noticed that the pattern being woven didn't match what was programmed into the computer. Instead of the solid blue fabric that should have been produced, the machine was creating text woven directly into the material. The words were barely visible, slightly darker threads forming letters against the blue background. But when you looked closely, you could clearly read the message: "Check conveyor belt 3 tomorrow morning." My first thought was that someone had tampered with the computer program as a prank. But when I examined the system, everything appeared normal. The programming showed the correct pattern for solid blue fabric, and there were no unauthorized changes in the command history. I reset the machine and restarted production, and it returned to creating the proper fabric without any problems. I documented the incident in my shift report, but didn't make a big deal about it since the machine was functioning normally again. The next morning, during the day shift changeover, I mentioned the weird message to Tom Rodriguez, the maintenance supervisor. He laughed it off initially, but curiosity got the better of him, and he decided to inspect conveyor belt 3 just to be thorough. What he found was a hairline crack in one of the support bearings that would have caused a catastrophic failure within hours, potentially injuring several workers and shutting down that entire production line for days. The bearing was replaced immediately, and Tom credited my random observation with preventing a serious accident. I tried to convince myself that the whole thing was just a coincidence, that maybe I had subconsciously noticed something wrong with the conveyor belt, and my mind had somehow influenced my perception of the fabric pattern. But deep down, I knew that explanation didn't make sense. I hadn't been anywhere near conveyor belt 3 during my shift, and I had no reason to be thinking about maintenance issues with equipment outside my assigned area. 3 weeks later, it happened again. Machine 7 was producing white fabric for bed sheets when it started weaving another message. Forklift accident loading dock 2 hours. This time, I immediately called Tom Rodriguez and had him come down to see the message for himself. He was skeptical until he saw the words clearly woven into the fabric. Letters formed by slightly different thread tensions that created a barely visible text against the white background. We immediately contacted the loading dock supervisor and had all forklift operations suspended for inspection. Sure enough, they discovered that one of the forklifts had a hydraulic leak that had weakened the lifting mechanism. The unit was taken out of service, and 2 hours later, during what would have been a routine loading operation, the hydraulic system completely failed. If someone had been operating that forklift at the time, they could have been seriously injured or killed when the load dropped unexpectedly. Word about Machine 7's predictions spread quickly through the factory, and people started referring to it as the Oracle machine. Some workers thought it was fascinating, others found it disturbing, and a few refused to work anywhere near it. Management was initially skeptical, but after the machine correctly predicted 3 more safety incidents over the next month, they started taking the warnings seriously. A protocol was established where any unusual messages woven into fabric would be immediately reported and investigated. The messages became more frequent and more specific over time. Machine 7 would predict electrical fires, chemical spills, equipment malfunctions, and even medical emergencies involving specific workers. The warnings were always accurate, usually occurring within 24 to 48 hours of the message appearing in the fabric. The machine somehow knew about problems with equipment it had no connection to, in areas of the factory it couldn't possibly monitor, involving people it had no way of observing. The most unsettling incident happened in September when Machine 7 produced a message that read, "Jerry Martinez heart attack, break room Thursday, 3:15 a.m. Jerry was a 53-year-old maintenance worker who had no history of heart problems and seemed to be in good health. The message appeared on Tuesday night, giving us almost 2 days' notice. Management was reluctant to approach Jerry directly with such a specific and frightening prediction, but they arranged for the company nurse to be on site during the Thursday night shift and had paramedics on standby nearby. At exactly 3:12 a.m. on Thursday, Jerry collapsed in the break room with what turned out to be a massive heart attack. Because medical help was immediately available, He survived and made a full recovery after emergency surgery. The doctor said that if he hadn't received treatment within minutes of the attack, he would have died. Jerry is convinced that Machine 7 saved his life, and he now checks with me regularly to see if the machine has produced any messages about him or his family. I started keeping detailed records of every message the machine produced, trying to find some pattern or explanation for how it was generating these predictions. I researched the history of the factory, looking for accidents, deaths, or unusual incidents that might have some connection to the machine's behavior. What I discovered was disturbing. The location where Machine 7 was installed had been the site of a fatal accident 12 years earlier, when a worker named Daniel Chen was killed after getting caught in the old mechanical loom that used to occupy that spot. According to the accident report, Daniel had been trying to clear a jam when his clothing got tangled in the machinery, and he was pulled into the gears before anyone could shut down the equipment. He died instantly, and the old machine was removed shortly afterward. The area remained unused for several years before Machine 7 was installed in the exact same location. I began to wonder if somehow Daniel's presence was influencing the new machine, using it to prevent other workers from experiencing the same kind of preventable accidents that had killed him. It sounds crazy, I know, but I couldn't come up with any rational explanation for how a computer-controlled weaving machine could predict future events with perfect accuracy. The situation took a darker turn when Machine 7 started producing messages about incidents outside the factory. It predicted a car accident involving one of our workers' family members, a house fire in the neighborhood, and even a robbery at the convenience store where many of us bought our lunch. These predictions were just as accurate as the workplace warnings, but they raised questions about how far the machine's awareness extended and whether we had any responsibility to act on information about events beyond our immediate workplace. The final message that convinced me to leave Millbrook Textile appeared last month. Machine 7 wove the words, "Factory closing, permanent December, all jobs lost, investors pulling out." I immediately brought the message to management, but they dismissed it as impossible, pointing out that the company had a full order book and profitable operations. 3 days later, the parent company announced that they were closing the Millbrook facility and moving all production overseas, effective December 31st. I put in my notice the following week and found a job at a different manufacturing plant across town. I couldn't continue working with a machine that seemed to know things it shouldn't know, that somehow had access to information about the future that even the people making the decisions didn't have yet. Some of my former co-workers think I'm crazy for leaving a good job over superstitious nonsense. But I've seen too much to dismiss Machine 7 as just a malfunctioning piece of equipment. I still drive by the Millbrook factory sometimes, and I can see the lights on in the building where Machine 7 continues to operate. I wonder if it's still producing warnings, still trying to help the remaining workers avoid accidents and disasters. Part of me feels guilty for abandoning the machine and the protective spirit that seems to inhabit it. But I couldn't handle the responsibility of knowing what was coming and being powerless to prevent most of it. Sometimes technology becomes a conduit for things we don't understand. And sometimes the dead find ways to continue protecting the living, even from beyond the grave. My name is Alani, and I worked the overnight shift at a 24-hour gas station on Highway 9 for about 8 months. It's one of those places that serves as a lifeline for long-distance truckers, late-night commuters, and people traveling through our small town at odd hours. The job wasn't particularly demanding. Pump gas for customers who needed help, stock shelves, clean the store, and handle the occasional drunk or difficult customer. I took the position because it paid better than most entry-level jobs in our area, and the night shift differential helped me save money for college. I thought the biggest challenge would be staying awake during the quiet hours between 2 and 5 a.m. when hardly anyone stopped by. I never expected to encounter a customer who had been dead for 6 months. The Sunoco station where I worked sits at the intersection of Highway 9 and County Road 15, about 5 miles outside of town. It's a typical small-town gas station with 6 pumps, a convenience store that sells snacks and basic necessities, and a small auto repair bay that's closed during my shift. The overnight hours were usually pretty predictable. A steady stream of truckers, shift workers heading home from the plant, and the occasional traveler passing through. Most customers were polite but tired, just wanting to fuel up and get back on the road as quickly as possible. My shift ran from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., 6 nights a week. The first few months were uneventful, and I settled into a comfortable routine. I'd spend the busy period from 11 p.m. to 1 a.m. helping customers and restocking, then use the quieter hours to deep clean the store, update inventory, and study for my classes. The store had security cameras and a direct line to the police, so I never felt unsafe, even during the loneliest parts of the night, when sometimes an hour would pass without a single customer. The regular customer I'm going to tell you about first appeared in late October. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with gray hair and a weathered face that suggested he'd spent a lot of time outdoors. He drove a faded blue pickup truck that looked like it had seen better days, and he always arrived at exactly 3:17 a.m. His routine never varied. He'd pump exactly $8 worth of regular gasoline, come inside to pay with cash, and buy the same 3 items: a pack of Marlboro Red cigarettes, a large black coffee, and a package of peanut butter crackers. What made this customer memorable wasn't just his precise timing and consistent purchases, but his demeanor. He was always polite, calling me Miss, and thanking me for working the late shift to help people like him. He spoke with a slight southern accent and had the kind of old-fashioned manners that are rare these days. He never seemed to be in a hurry, often commenting on the weather or asking how I was doing with my studies. In a job where most interactions are brief and impersonal, his friendliness stood out. After a few weeks, I started looking forward to his visits. The 3:17 a.m. time slot was usually the deadest part of my shift, and his arrival provided a welcome break in the monotony. He told me his name was Earl, that he worked construction jobs around the region, and that he often drove at night to avoid traffic and beat the heat. His explanations for his late-night travels seemed reasonable, and I had no reason to question anything about him. The pattern continued for months. Every Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday night, Earl would arrive at exactly 3:17 a.m., follow his exact routine, and drive off into the darkness. He never deviated from this schedule, never arrived even a minute early or late, and never varied his purchases. I began to set my watch by his visits, using his arrival as a marker to track the progress of my shift. The first sign that something was wrong came in early March, when I mentioned Earl to my day shift counterpart, Linda. I was describing some of our regular customers, and when I told her about the older man who came in 3 times a week at 3:17 a.m., she looked confused. She said she'd been working at the station for 5 years and had never heard of anyone matching that description. When I showed her the security footage from one of Earl's visits, she insisted she'd never seen him before, which seemed impossible given how long he'd supposedly been coming to the station. I decided to look more carefully at Earl during his next visit, paying attention to details I might have missed before. That's when I noticed things that should have been obvious, but somehow hadn't registered. His clothes, while always clean, seemed to be the same outfit every time: a blue work shirt, faded jeans, and brown boots. His truck, while old and worn, never seemed to get any dirtier or more damaged, despite his claims of traveling long distances for construction work. Most importantly, I realized I had never actually seen him consume any of the items he purchased. Curious, I started checking our inventory and sales records more carefully. According to our computer system, no one was purchasing cigarettes, coffee, and crackers at 3:17 a.m. on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday nights. The transactions weren't showing up in our sales data, and the items Earl was supposedly buying weren't missing from our inventory. Somehow, he was going through the motions of purchasing items without any actual exchange of goods or money taking place. This discovery frightened me more than it should have. I knew what I was seeing with my own eyes, but the evidence suggested that Earl's visits weren't really happening, at least not in any way that the store's systems could detect. I started keeping a personal log of his visits, noting the exact time, what he said, and any other details I could observe. I also started taking photos with my phone during his visits, hoping to gather some kind of proof that these encounters were real. The photographs were the most disturbing evidence of all. In every picture I took while Earl was supposedly standing in front of me, talking and going through his purchasing routine, the images showed an empty store. The security cameras, when I reviewed the footage later, showed me apparently talking to no one, handling merchandise that would mysteriously return to its original position after Earl left, and acting out conversations with someone who wasn't there. I began to seriously question my sanity. Was I having some kind of breakdown? Was the isolation and stress of working alone during the night shift causing me to hallucinate detailed interactions with a non-existent person? I considered seeking medical help, but Earl's visits seemed so real, so consistent, and so detailed that I couldn't accept that they were just figments of my imagination. The truth came out when I finally decided to research Earl more thoroughly. I spent hours online searching for information about construction workers in the area, looking through local obituaries, and checking news archives. What I found made my blood run cold. Earl Patterson, age 63, had died in a car accident on Highway 9 6 months before I started working at the gas station. According to the news report, he had been driving home from a construction job at 3:20 a.m. when his blue pickup truck skidded off the road and crashed into a tree. He was killed instantly. The accident had happened less than a mile from the gas station, at the exact time when Earl had been appearing in my store 3 times a week. The newspaper article included a photograph of Earl, and it was unmistakably the same man I had been talking to for months. The article also mentioned that he was a regular customer at the Sunoco station, often stopping by during his late-night drives to and from work sites. Armed with this information, I confronted Earl during his next visit. When he walked into the store at exactly 3:17 a.m. and began his usual routine, I asked him directly about the accident. He stopped what he was doing, looked at me with sad eyes, and said, "I was wondering when you'd figure it out, miss. I've been trying to get home for months now, but I keep ending up here instead." He explained that he didn't understand what had happened to him, that he remembered leaving a job site and driving toward home, but that somehow he kept finding himself at the gas station, going through the same routine he had followed for years when he was alive. He said he was grateful that I had been kind to him, that most people couldn't see him anymore, and that our conversations had been the only human contact he'd had since the accident. Earl told me that he thought he was stuck because he had unfinished business, debts he hadn't paid, and family members he hadn't reconciled with before his death. He asked me to help him contact his daughter, who lived in the next county, to let her know that he was sorry for the things he'd said during their last argument and that he loved her. He also wanted me to make sure his final paycheck went to paying off a loan he'd taken from a friend. I helped Earl resolve these issues over the next few weeks, making phone calls and visits on his behalf. His daughter was initially skeptical, but eventually grateful to receive his message of love and forgiveness. His final paycheck was indeed used to pay off the debt he'd mentioned. After I had completed these tasks, Earl appeared one last time at 3:17 a.m., thanked me for my kindness, and walked out of the store into a bright light that seemed to be waiting for him in the parking lot. I never saw him again after that night, and I quit my job at the gas station shortly afterward. I couldn't continue working there knowing that I had spent months talking to a dead man. And I was afraid that other spirits might try to contact me if they knew I could see and hear them. Sometimes the boundary between life and death is thinner than we realize, and sometimes the living are called to help the dead find peace. My name is Timothy, and I worked as a night shift forklift operator at Consolidated Freight Distribution for almost 3 years. It's a massive warehouse complex that handles shipments for dozens of companies, moving everything from electronics to clothing to household goods through our facility before they reach retail stores across the region. The night shift was responsible for processing incoming freight, organizing inventory, and preparing outbound shipments for morning pickup. It was honest work that paid well, and I prided myself on being efficient and reliable. I never asked questions about what was in the boxes I moved. That wasn't my job. Until I started recognizing items that belonged to people who had been reported missing on the local news. Consolidated Freight operates out of a 200,000 square foot warehouse on the outskirts of the industrial district. The building is divided into different zones based on the type of merchandise and shipping requirements. My assigned area was Zone C, which handled miscellaneous consumer goods, personal items, and what our supervisor called specialty shipments, packages that required special handling or had unusual documentation. The night crew consisted of about 15 people, including forklift operators, inventory clerks, and loading dock workers, all supervised by a shift manager named Craig Morrison. The work was routine but physically demanding. I'd arrive at 10 p.m. and spend the next 10 hours moving pallets, organizing inventory, and loading trucks for morning delivery. The warehouse ran on a tight schedule, and efficiency was everything. We were evaluated based on how many shipments we processed per hour, so there wasn't much time for casual conversation or paying attention to anything beyond the immediate task at hand. Most of us wore headphones and focused on our assigned work areas, barely interacting except during breaks. Zone C received shipments from various sources, but a significant portion came from a company called Summit Acquisitions, which our paperwork described as an estate sale and liquidation service. These shipments typically contained personal belongings, furniture, electronics, and household items that had supposedly been purchased from estate sales, bankruptcy auctions, or storage unit cleanouts. The items were usually packed in unmarked boxes or plastic bins, then repackaged and shipped to discount retailers, online auction sites, or overseas buyers. For the first year and a half, I processed Summit Acquisition shipments without giving them much thought. The items seemed like typical used goods: clothing, books, kitchen appliances, jewelry, photo albums, personal documents. Sometimes the shipments included more valuable items like laptops, tablets, or camera equipment. But everything appeared to be legitimate second-hand merchandise. The paperwork was always in order, and Craig Morrison never indicated that there was anything unusual about these particular shipments. The first time I noticed something disturbing was in September of last year. I was unpacking a Summit Acquisition shipment when I found a child's backpack with a name tag that read, Jessica Chen, age 8, Lincoln Elementary School. The backpack contained school supplies, a lunchbox, and several items that were clearly personal belongings, rather than things you'd typically find at an estate sale. What caught my attention was that the backpack looked relatively new and well-maintained, not like something that had been sitting in storage or belonged to someone who had recently passed away. The name Jessica Chen sounded familiar, and when I got home that morning, I searched online and found a missing person report from 6 months earlier. Jessica Chen, age 8, had disappeared while walking home from school in a town about 50 miles from our warehouse. The description matched the backpack I'd processed, and the photos in the news articles showed Jessica wearing the same backpack on the day she vanished. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, that maybe the family had donated Jessica's belongings after giving up hope. But something about the timing and condition of the items didn't feel right. Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention to the Summit acquisition shipments, looking for anything that seemed out of place or suspicious. What I discovered made my stomach turn. Mixed in with the typical estate sale items were personal belongings that were too recent, too well-maintained, and too personal to have been legitimately acquired through normal channels. I found wallets with IDs still inside, cell phones that hadn't been wiped of personal data, prescription medications with recent dates, and family photos that showed people who were very much alive. I began documenting what I was finding, taking photos with my phone when I could do so without being observed. The items fell into patterns that became increasingly disturbing. There were belongings from elderly people who had supposedly died alone with no family to claim their possessions, but the items suggested these people had been living normal, active lives right up until their disappearance. There were possessions from young adults who had supposedly died in accidents or overdoses. But their belongings included recent pay stubs, current medication, and evidence of ongoing relationships and responsibilities. The breakthrough came when I found a box containing the personal effects of Maria Santos, a 34-year-old woman who had been reported missing 3 months earlier from a town about 30 miles away. The box contained her purse with her ID and credit cards, her car keys, her work uniform from the restaurant where she'd been employed, and most disturbingly, her cell phone, which still contained recent text messages from family members asking where she was and expressing concern about her disappearance. I knew I had stumbled onto something criminal, but I also knew I needed to be careful about how I handled the situation. If Summit Acquisitions was involved in something illegal, they likely had connections within the shipping and logistics industry that could make my job, or my life, very difficult if they discovered I was investigating them. I decided to gather more evidence before going to the authorities, documenting as many suspicious shipments as possible to build a comprehensive case. The pattern that emerged was horrifying. Summit Acquisitions was receiving personal belongings from people who had vanished under suspicious circumstances across a tri-state area. The items were being processed through our warehouse and then shipped to various destinations, presumably to be sold or disposed of in ways that would make it difficult to trace them back to the missing persons. The operation was sophisticated, using legitimate shipping channels and proper documentation to move evidence of crimes through the interstate commerce system. I also discovered that Craig Morrison, our shift supervisor, was directly involved in the operation. He was the one who assigned specific workers to handle Summit Acquisition shipments, and he had been selecting employees who were less likely to ask questions or notice discrepancies. Workers who showed too much curiosity about the contents of certain shipments were transferred to different zones or found themselves facing disciplinary actions that led to termination. The most disturbing revelation came when I realized that some of the missing persons whose belongings I'd been processing had disappeared after being seen in or near our warehouse district. The area was known for late-night trucking activity, and it would have been relatively easy for someone to abduct people from the poorly lit streets around the industrial complex. I began to suspect that the warehouse itself might be serving as more than just a distribution point for stolen goods. It might be part of the actual operation that was making people disappear. I decided to contact the FBI rather than local police, since the operation clearly crossed state lines and involved interstate commerce. I compiled all of my documentation, including photos of the suspicious items, copies of shipping manifests, and a detailed timeline of the shipments I'd observed. I also provided information about Craig Morrison's role and the pattern of employee transfers that seemed designed to keep curious workers away from certain shipments. The federal investigation moved quickly once they understood the scope of what was happening. Agents raided the warehouse on a Tuesday night during our normal shift, arresting Craig Morrison and several other employees who had been directly involved in the operation. They also raided Summit Acquisitions offices and discovered that the company was a front for a human trafficking and murder-for-hire organization that had been operating across multiple states for over 5 years. The investigation revealed that the missing persons whose belongings I'd been processing had been killed by the organization, either as part of contract murders or because they had witnessed criminal activities. Their personal effects were being processed through legitimate shipping channels to dispose of evidence and make it harder for law enforcement to connect the crimes. The warehouse had indeed been used as a location for some of the murders, with victims being lured to the industrial district and killed in a soundproof room that had been constructed in an unused section of the building. Over 30 missing persons cases were solved as a result of the investigation, and several members of the criminal organization received life sentences for murder and human trafficking. I was placed in witness protection for several months while the trials were ongoing, since my testimony was crucial to proving how the evidence disposal operation worked and identifying other potential victims. I never went back to warehouse work after that experience. I couldn't handle the idea of processing shipments without wondering what might be hidden in the boxes, or whether I was unknowingly helping criminals cover up their activities. The experience taught me that evil can hide within normal business operations, using legitimate infrastructure to facilitate horrible crimes, and that sometimes ordinary workers are the only ones in a position to notice when something terrible is happening right under everyone's noses. I still have nightmares about opening those boxes and finding pieces of people's lives that had been stolen along with their futures. But I'm grateful that I paid attention when something seemed wrong, and that I was able to help bring justice to the families of those victims who deserved so much better than becoming anonymous shipments in a criminal enterprise. My name is Knox, and until 2 months ago, I hosted the overnight radio show at WKRP 103.7 FM, a classic rock station that served our Tri-County area. Late Night with Knox ran from midnight to 6 a.m., 6 nights a week, and I'd been doing the show for about 4 years. It was the perfect job for someone like me, a night owl who loved music and didn't mind talking to empty air for hours at a time. Most of my audience consisted of insomniacs, shift workers, long-haul truckers, and people who just couldn't sleep. I prided myself on being there for anyone who needed a friendly voice in the darkness, taking calls from lonely listeners and dedicating songs to help people through difficult nights. I never imagined that one of those callers would turn out to be someone who was committing murders while talking to me on the air. WKRP operated out of a small building on the edge of town, with a modest studio setup that had been updated piecemeal over the years, but still maintained that classic radio station feel. During my shift, I was usually alone in the building, except for a part-time engineer who would sometimes come in to handle technical issues. The isolation never bothered me. In fact, I enjoyed the solitude and the feeling that I was broadcasting into the void, connecting with people across the listening area who were awake while the rest of the world slept. My show format was pretty simple. I'd play classic rock deep cuts mixed with some newer alternative music, share interesting stories about the artists and songs, and take calls from listeners who wanted to request music or just talk. The call-in segment was always popular during the late-night hours when people felt more willing to share personal stories or discuss topics they might not talk about during daylight hours. I encouraged listeners to call in with whatever was on their minds, and over the years, I'd talked to people about everything from relationship problems to philosophical questions to memories triggered by specific songs. The caller I'm going to tell you about first reached out to me in late June. He never gave me a name, just asked me to call him Mike, and his voice had a distinctive quality. Calm, articulate, with a slight accent I couldn't quite place. Mike would call in every Tuesday and Thursday night, usually around 2:30 a.m., and he always wanted to talk about music and life in general. He seemed to have extensive knowledge about classic rock history and would often share interesting anecdotes about bands and albums that even I hadn't heard before. What made Mike memorable wasn't just his musical knowledge, but his philosophical nature. He would call in and want to discuss deep topics: the meaning of existence, the nature of good and evil, what happens to people after they die. His calls were thoughtful and engaging, and I found myself looking forward to our conversations. He never seemed rushed or distracted, always spoke in complete sentences, and had a way of making profound observations about human nature that resonated with me and, based on listener feedback, with my audience as well. After about a month of regular calls, Mike began sharing what he described as real-time observations about human behavior. He would call in and describe scenes he was supposedly witnessing. People walking alone at night, couples arguing in parking lots, individuals making what he called life-changing decisions in isolated locations. His descriptions were incredibly detailed and vivid, almost like he was providing live commentary on events happening around our listening area. At first, I thought Mike was just a creative storyteller who enjoyed spinning interesting narratives for the radio audience. His descriptions had a cinematic quality that made for compelling radio, and listeners seemed to enjoy the mysterious calls from this philosophical observer of late-night human activity. I began to feature his calls as a regular segment, encouraging him to share his field reports, as I jokingly called them. The first hint that something was seriously wrong came in early August, when Mike called in and described in detail a scene involving a young woman walking alone through the downtown area. He talked about her appearance, her behavior, what she was wearing, and speculated about where she might be going at such a late hour. His description was so specific and detailed that it seemed like he had to be looking directly at this person while talking to me. The next morning, I learned that a woman matching Mike's exact description had been found murdered in an alley downtown. The timing of the discovery, the location, and the victim's appearance all matched what Mike had described during our call the night before. The police report mentioned that the victim had been killed sometime between 2 and 3 a.m., which was exactly when Mike had been talking to me about seeing her. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Mike's call had been more than just storytelling. I started paying closer attention to the details he provided during his calls, taking notes about locations, times, and descriptions of the people he claimed to be observing. I also began checking local news reports and police activity logs to see if there were any correlations between Mike's observations and actual events. The pattern that emerged was terrifying. Every detailed scene that Mike described during his calls corresponded to a violent crime that occurred within hours of our conversation. He would call in and describe someone in a specific location, provide detailed observations about their behavior and appearance, and then that person would be found dead or seriously injured in that exact location shortly after our show ended. Mike's descriptions weren't just accurate. They were impossibly precise. He would describe clothing that victims were wearing, specific injuries they had sustained, and even quote conversations that had taken place during the attacks. It became clear that Mike wasn't just observing these crimes. He was actively participating in them, calling me from crime scenes while the attacks were happening or immediately afterward. The most chilling realization was that Mike was using my radio show as a confessional, describing his murders to a listening audience without anyone realizing what they were hearing. He would present his crimes as philosophical observations about human nature, discussing the victim's final moments as if he was analyzing their psychological states, rather than describing his role in ending their lives. I faced an impossible dilemma. If I was right about Mike being a killer, I had a responsibility to contact law enforcement immediately. But I also knew that alerting the wrong people could put me in danger, especially if Mike was listening to my show regularly and would realize that I had figured out his true purpose for calling. I also worried about the legal implications of having unknowingly provided a platform for someone to discuss their crimes on the air. I decided to contact the FBI through their anonymous tip line, providing them with recordings of Mike's calls and documentation of the correlation between his descriptions and subsequent crime discoveries. Federal agents took my report seriously and began monitoring my show, recording all incoming calls and tracing the source of Mike's communications. The breakthrough came when Mike called in on a Thursday night in September and made a critical mistake. While describing his latest observation, he provided details about the location that were too specific, mentioning a broken street light and construction equipment that would allow investigators to identify the exact spot he was calling from. FBI agents were able to triangulate his location and arrive at the scene while he was still on the phone with me. What they found was horrific. Mike was calling me from a location where he had just murdered 2 people, using a victim's cell phone to make the call while standing over their bodies. He had been using different phones for each call, taking them from his victims and disposing of them after using them to contact my show. The agents arrested him while he was still talking to me on the air, and I heard the entire confrontation live as it happened. The investigation revealed that Mike, whose real name was David Kellerman, had been using my radio show as part of an elaborate psychological game. He enjoyed describing his crimes to an unknowing audience, getting validation and attention for his murders while maintaining the pretense of being a thoughtful philosopher. He had killed 11 people over the course of 2 months, calling in after each murder to share his observations with my listeners. David confessed to the murders and explained that he had chosen my show specifically because of my reputation for being welcoming to unusual callers and my willingness to engage in deep conversations about human nature. He had been studying my show for months before making his first call, learning my schedule and format to maximize the impact of his confessions. I quit my radio job immediately after the arrest. I couldn't continue hosting a show, knowing that I had unknowingly provided a platform for someone to celebrate and discuss their murders. The experience taught me that evil can hide behind the most ordinary interactions, that someone can seem thoughtful and articulate while being a monster, and that sometimes the people who seem most interested in discussing human nature are the ones who have abandoned their own humanity. I still wake up sometimes thinking about those calls, wondering if I could have figured out what was happening sooner and prevented some of those deaths. But I'm grateful that my cooperation with law enforcement helped bring a killer to justice and prevented him from claiming more victims. Sometimes the voices that reach out to us in the darkness aren't looking for comfort or connection. Sometimes they're looking for an audience for their evil, and we have to be prepared to recognize the difference. My name is Harmony, and I worked as a 911 emergency dispatcher for 3 years at the County Communications Center. It's a job that requires you to stay calm under pressure, make split-second decisions that can save lives, and deal with the worst moments of other people's existence on a daily basis. I'd handled thousands of emergency calls during my time there. Everything from medical emergencies to domestic violence situations to major accidents. I thought I'd heard every possible scenario that could come through those phone lines until I started receiving calls from a family that had been murdered 5 years before I was even hired. The county communications center operates 24 hours a day, with dispatchers working 12-hour shifts to ensure continuous coverage. The night shift, which I worked from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., was typically busier than most people realize. Drunk driving accidents, domestic disputes that escalate after bars close, medical emergencies involving elderly people who live alone. The overnight hours brought their own unique challenges. I'd been trained to handle multiple emergency lines simultaneously, coordinate with various law enforcement agencies, and maintain detailed logs of every call and response. My workstation consisted of multiple computer monitors displaying maps, unit locations, and emergency protocols, along with a sophisticated phone system that could handle dozens of incoming calls simultaneously. The technology was designed to automatically record every conversation, track the source of incoming calls, and provide real-time information about emergency responders in the field. It was a high-tech operation that prided itself on efficiency and reliability, which is why what started happening in March of last year was so disturbing. The first call came in on a Tuesday night around 2:15 a.m. The caller ID showed an address at 1247 Maple Street, and when I answered, I heard a woman's voice screaming, "Please help us. Someone's in the house. He's got a gun, and he's—" The line went dead before she could finish the sentence. I immediately dispatched police units to the address and tried calling back, but the phone just rang without anyone answering. When the officers arrived at 1247 Maple Street, they found the house dark and apparently empty. They conducted a thorough search of the property but found no signs of a break-in, no evidence of a struggle, and no indication that anyone was currently living there. The responding officers reported that the house appeared to be vacant, with no furniture, no personal belongings, and utilities that had been shut off for an extended period. I assumed there had been some kind of technical error with the caller ID system, that the call had actually originated from a different location and been incorrectly routed through our system. These kinds of glitches were rare, but not unheard of, especially with older phone equipment or cell towers that might misreport location data. I documented the incident and moved on to other calls, but something about the woman's voice stayed with me. The genuine terror in her tone. The way she'd been cut off mid-sentence. 3 weeks later, I received another call from the same address. This time it was a different voice. A young girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old, crying and whispering, "The bad man hurt Mommy and Daddy. I'm hiding in the closet, but I think he knows where I am. Please come help us." Again, the line went dead abruptly, and again I dispatched units to 1247 Maple Street. The officers found the same empty house, no signs of life, no evidence of any emergency. I began to research the address more thoroughly, accessing property records and incident reports to understand what might be causing these phantom calls. What I discovered made my skin crawl. 5 years earlier, a family named the Hendersons had been murdered in their home at 1247 Maple Street during a home invasion robbery. Robert Henderson, age 42, Sarah Henderson, age 38, and their daughter Emma Henderson, age 8, had all been killed by an intruder who had broken in during the early morning hours. The case file made for horrific reading. The killer had entered through a basement window around 2 a.m., confronted Robert Henderson first and shot him in the living room. Then pursued Sarah Henderson through the house before killing her in the kitchen. 8-year-old Emma had hidden in her bedroom closet and called 911. But the killer had found her before police could arrive. The entire family had been murdered in the span of about 15 minutes, and the killer had escaped with jewelry and cash, never to be identified or caught. The similarities between the historical crime and the calls I was receiving were unmistakable. The timing matched. Both the original 911 call from Emma Henderson and the recent calls I'd received had come in around 2:15 a.m. The voices matched the descriptions of the victims: an adult woman, presumably Sarah Henderson, and a young girl who could only be Emma calling from her hiding place in the closet. I was receiving 911 calls from the Henderson family, somehow replaying the night they were murdered, reaching across time to beg for help that would never come. Over the next several months, the calls became more frequent and more detailed. I would receive calls from Robert Henderson, describing an intruder breaking into his basement and asking for immediate police response. I would hear Sarah Henderson calling from different rooms in the house, her voice becoming more panicked as she described being chased through her own home by someone intent on killing her. Most heartbreaking were the calls from Emma, hiding in her closet and whispering descriptions of what she could hear happening to her parents. Each call provided more pieces of the puzzle about what had happened that night. Through Robert's calls, I learned that the killer had cut the phone lines after breaking in, which explained why the original 911 call from Emma had been so brief. Through Sarah's calls, I discovered that she had tried to escape through the back door, but found it blocked by the intruder's accomplice. Through Emma's calls, I heard the killer systematically searching the house for any remaining family members after murdering her parents. The technical impossibility of what was happening didn't escape me. The house at 1247 Maple Street had no active phone service, no electrical power, and had been vacant for years. There was no physical way for calls to originate from that location. Yet the calls kept coming, always from the same number, always during the overnight shift when the original murders had taken place, always replaying different moments from that horrible night. I began documenting every call in detail, creating a timeline of the Henderson family's final hours based on the information they were somehow providing me from beyond the grave. The picture that emerged was of a family that had fought desperately to survive, that had tried to protect each other, and that had died knowing help was too far away to save them. The most disturbing aspect of these calls was that they weren't just replaying the past. They seemed to be aware of me as their dispatcher. Robert Henderson would ask me by name to send units to his address. Sarah Henderson would beg me specifically to help her children. Emma Henderson would tell me she was scared and ask me to stay on the line with her until the police arrived. They knew who I was, even though I hadn't been working as a dispatcher when they were killed. The calls began to take a serious emotional toll on me. I would dread coming to work, knowing that I would likely receive calls from people I couldn't help, people who were already dead, people who were reliving their worst moments over and over again. I started having nightmares about the Henderson family, imagining their final moments, wondering if there was anything different I could say or do that might somehow change their fate. And the situation escalated when the calls started providing new information about their killer. During one call, Robert Henderson described the intruder in detail: his appearance, his voice, the vehicle he was driving. Sarah Henderson provided information about a second person who had been waiting outside the house. Emma Henderson, with the observational skills of a child, described distinctive tattoos and jewelry worn by the killer. I realized that the Henderson family was trying to solve their own murder, using me as a conduit to provide information that could lead to their killer's identification and arrest. I compiled all of the details they had given me during the calls and submitted them to the detective, who had originally worked their case. Detective Martinez was initially skeptical about my claims, but when I played him recordings of the calls and showed him how the information correlated with evidence from the original crime scene, he agreed to reopen the investigation. Using the new details provided by the Henderson family's calls, investigators were able to identify DNA evidence that had been overlooked during the original investigation and match it to a man named Carl Brennan. who was currently serving time for unrelated burglary charges. Brennan confessed to the Henderson murders when confronted with the DNA evidence, and he was subsequently charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder. He also provided information that led to the arrest of his accomplice, who had been the person waiting outside the house during the killings. After Brennan's arrest and conviction, the calls from 1247 Maple Street stopped. I never heard from the Henderson family again, and I like to think that they found peace knowing their killer had finally been brought to justice. I transferred to a different department shortly afterward because I couldn't continue working as a 911 dispatcher, knowing that the voices calling for help might not always belong to the living. Sometimes the dead refuse to rest until justice is served, and sometimes they find ways to reach out to those of us who are willing to listen and help them find the closure they desperately need. My name is Tate, and I worked as a night shift pharmacy technician at Westfield Medical Center for 2.5 years. The hospital pharmacy operates around the clock to ensure that patients receive their medications when needed, and the overnight shift was responsible for filling prescriptions, restocking automated dispensing machines throughout the hospital, and handling emergency medication requests from the various departments. It was detail-oriented work that required precision and careful attention to patient safety protocols. I took pride in my accuracy and efficiency, and I thought I understood every aspect of how our pharmacy system worked until I started receiving prescription orders for patients who had died months or even years earlier. Westfield Medical Center is a 400-bed regional hospital that serves several surrounding counties. The pharmacy department processes thousands of prescriptions each day using a sophisticated computer system that tracks patient information, medication histories, insurance approvals, and drug interactions. The night shift typically handled about 200 to 300 prescriptions during a 12-hour period, ranging from routine medications for long-term patients to emergency drugs needed for trauma cases or surgical procedures. My workstation included multiple computer terminals that displayed incoming prescription orders, patient information, and inventory levels. The system was designed with multiple safeguards to prevent errors. Every prescription had to be verified by a licensed pharmacist before dispensing. Patient identities were confirmed through multiple data points, and automated alerts would flag any potential problems with dosages, allergies, or drug interactions. It was a highly regulated environment where accuracy was literally a matter of life and death. The first unusual prescription order appeared in my queue on a Thursday night in January. The system showed an order for cardiac medication prescribed to a patient named Margaret Chen, room 3114B. The prescription itself seemed routine, digitalis for heart failure management. But when I looked up the patient information, something seemed wrong. According to the system, Mrs. Chen was listed as a 78-year-old woman admitted for cardiac monitoring. But when I tried to verify her current room assignment, the hospital registration system showed room 3120B as unoccupied. I assumed there had been a clerical error, perhaps a patient transfer that hadn't been properly updated in the system. I called the nursing station for the 3rd floor to confirm Mrs. Chen's location. But the charge nurse told me they had no patient by that name currently on their unit. When I checked with the admissions office, they confirmed that Margaret Chen had been discharged 2 days earlier after a brief stay for chest pain evaluation. The strange part was that the prescription order showed a timestamp from that current night, indicating that it had been entered just minutes before appearing in my queue. The ordering physician was listed as Dr. Rodriguez from the cardiology department. But when I called his service, they told me he was not currently on duty and had not entered any prescription orders that evening. Despite these discrepancies, the order remained active in my system, waiting to be filled. I documented the incident and reported it to the night supervisor, who suggested that it might be a system glitch where old prescription data was being reprocessed incorrectly. She advised me to cancel the order and monitor for similar occurrences. I followed her instructions, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something more significant was happening. Over the next few weeks, similar phantom prescriptions began appearing in my queue with increasing frequency. Orders would come through for patients who were not currently admitted to the hospital, prescribed by doctors who were not on duty, for rooms that were either empty or occupied by completely different patients. When I tried to trace the source of these orders, they seemed to originate from within our own hospital system. But no one could explain how they were being generated. I began keeping a detailed log of these phantom prescriptions, noting patient names, room numbers, medications ordered, and prescribing physicians. What I discovered was deeply unsettling. Every single phantom prescription was for a patient who had died during their stay at Westfield Medical Center, and the medications being ordered were the exact same drugs they had been receiving at the time of their death. Margaret Chen, the first phantom patient, had died of heart failure 3 months earlier while being treated with the same cardiac medication that appeared in my prescription queue. A patient named Robert Williams kept receiving orders for insulin, even though he had died of diabetic complications 6 months ago. An elderly woman named Dorothy Evans was being prescribed pain medication identical to what she had been receiving when she passed away from cancer 8 months earlier. The pattern was unmistakable. Deceased patients were somehow continuing to receive prescription orders through our hospital system, as if they were still alive and requiring ongoing medical treatment. The orders always came through during my night shift, typically between 2 and 4 a.m., and they always specified the exact room where each patient had died. I decided to investigate further by checking the medical records of the deceased patients whose prescriptions I was receiving. What I found made the situation even more disturbing. These weren't random patients who had died of natural causes. They were all people whose deaths had occurred under questionable circumstances or had involved some kind of medical error or negligence. Margaret Chen had died after receiving an incorrect dosage of cardiac medication due to a pharmacy error that had been covered up by the staff involved. Robert Williams had died because his insulin had been contaminated with bacteria, leading to a fatal infection that could have been prevented with proper quality control. Dorothy Evans had died after being given pain medication that interacted fatally with another drug she was taking, despite clear warnings in her medical chart about potential drug interactions. The phantom prescriptions weren't just random system glitches. They were appearing for patients whose deaths might have been preventable if proper protocols had been followed. It was as if these patients were trying to communicate that their deaths had been the result of medical negligence, using the same prescription system that had failed them in life to seek some kind of justice or acknowledgement after death. I began documenting not just the phantom prescriptions, but also the circumstances surrounding each patient's death. I accessed medical records, incident reports, and internal communications related to these cases, uncovering a pattern of medical errors, cover-ups, and institutional negligence that had resulted in multiple preventable deaths. The most shocking discovery came when I realized that several staff members, including pharmacists, nurses, and physicians, had been systematically falsifying records and hiding medical errors to protect themselves and the hospital from liability. Patients had died due to medication errors, equipment failures, and protocol violations, but their deaths had been attributed to natural causes or complications from their underlying conditions. The phantom prescriptions began providing more specific information about these cover-ups. Orders would include detailed notes about incorrect dosages, contaminated medications, or dangerous drug interactions that had been involved in each patient's death. It was as if the deceased patients were using the prescription system to document the medical errors that had killed them, creating a permanent record that couldn't be deleted or falsified like their original medical charts. I realized I was in possession of evidence of widespread medical malpractice and potentially criminal negligence that had resulted in multiple deaths. The phantom prescriptions were providing me with information that could expose the cover-ups and hold the responsible parties accountable for their actions. But I also knew that going public with this information would put my job and possibly my safety at risk, since some of the people involved in the cover-ups still worked at the hospital. I decided to contact the state medical board and the hospital's accreditation agency, providing them with copies of the phantom prescriptions and the documentation I had gathered about the suspicious deaths. I also reached out to the families of the deceased patients, sharing information about the circumstances of their loved ones' deaths and the evidence I had discovered of medical negligence. The investigations that followed revealed systematic problems with medication safety, quality control, and incident reporting at Westfield Medical Center. Several staff members were terminated, lost their professional licenses, or faced criminal charges for their role in covering up medical errors that had resulted in patient deaths. The hospital was fined millions of dollars and required to implement comprehensive reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. After the investigations concluded and the responsible parties were held accountable, the phantom prescriptions stopped appearing in my system. The deceased patients had apparently achieved their goal of exposing the medical negligence that had killed them and ensuring that justice was served. I continued working at the hospital for several more months. But the experience had fundamentally changed my perspective on the healthcare system and the trust that patients place in medical professionals. I eventually left Westfield Medical Center and now work at a different hospital where I've implemented additional safety protocols to prevent the kinds of errors that led to those preventable deaths. The experience taught me that the dead don't always rest quietly when they've been the victims of negligence or injustice, and that sometimes they find ways to ensure that the truth comes to light, even from beyond the grave. The phantom prescriptions were a reminder that every medication we dispense, every procedure we perform, and every decision we make has the potential to save or cost someone's life, and that we have a sacred responsibility to honor the trust that patients place in us to provide safe, competent care. My name is Mariella, and I worked as a waitress at the Highway 49 truck stop for 8 years before I discovered that some of my regular customers were involved in something far more sinister than long-haul shipping. The truck stop was a 24-hour operation that served as a lifeline for drivers traveling cross-country, offering fuel, food, showers, and a place to rest during mandatory break periods. I'd worked the overnight shift for most of those 8 years, serving coffee and meals to tired drivers who were just trying to make an honest living moving goods across America. I thought I knew my customers, understood their routines, and appreciated the hard work they did to keep our economy moving. I never suspected that a group of my most polite and dependable regular customers was using their legitimate trucking operation as cover for a child trafficking network that spanned multiple states. The Highway 49 truck stop sits at the intersection of 2 major interstate highways, making it a natural stopping point for drivers heading in any direction across the country. The facility includes a large parking area that can accommodate over 100 tractor trailers, a convenience store, a full-service restaurant, shower facilities, and a small motel for drivers who need more than just a nap in their cab. During my overnight shift, from 10 p.m. to 8 a.m., I would typically serve between 50 and 80 customers, most of whom were professional drivers on tight schedules who just wanted a quick meal and maybe some conversation with someone who understood the challenges of life on the road. Over the years, I got to know many of the regular drivers who passed through our location as part of their routine routes, These were professional truckers who took pride in their work, maintained clean and well-organized vehicles, and treated the truck stop staff with respect and courtesy. They would often share stories about their travels, show me photos of their families, and ask about my life and my plans for the future. The trucking community had its own culture and code of ethics, and most of the drivers I met were decent people who looked out for each other and appreciated having a friendly face to talk to during their long journeys. One group of regular customers stood out because of their consistency and professionalism. There were 6 drivers who would stop at our truck stop every 3 weeks, always traveling together in a convoy but driving separate trucks for different shipping companies. They called themselves the Highway Brotherhood and claimed to coordinate their schedules so they could travel the same routes and look out for each other on the road. The group was led by a driver named Bill Patterson, a soft-spoken man in his 50s who had been trucking for over 20 years and seemed to genuinely care about the younger drivers in his group. The Highway Brotherhood always arrived at our truck stop between 2 and 3 a.m., ordered the same meals, sat at the same cluster of tables, and stayed for exactly 90 minutes before continuing their journey. They were unfailingly polite, tipped well, and never caused any problems or complaints. Bill Patterson would always ask about my family, remember details about my personal life from previous conversations, and seemed like the kind of person you could trust with anything. The other members of the group were equally courteous, and they often talked about their own families, their experiences on the road, and their plans for retirement. What made this group particularly memorable was their obvious camaraderie and the way they looked out for each other. They would discuss route conditions, share information about good places to eat or sleep, and coordinate their travel plans to ensure everyone stayed safe and on schedule. They seemed to represent the best aspects of trucking culture: professional, responsible, and genuinely caring about their fellow drivers. I looked forward to their visits and considered them to be among my favorite customers. The first sign that something might be wrong came about 6 months ago when I noticed that one of the group members, a younger driver named Steve, seemed increasingly nervous and agitated during their visits. He had always been the quietest member of the Highway Brotherhood, but he started looking around constantly while they ate, as if he was afraid someone might be watching or listening to their conversations. When I asked Bill Patterson if Steve was okay, he explained that the younger driver was going through some personal problems and was considering leaving the trucking industry. A few weeks later, Steve stopped coming with the group, and Bill Patterson explained that he had indeed quit trucking and moved back to his hometown to be closer to his family. The remaining 5 members of the Highway Brotherhood continued their regular visits, but there was a noticeable change in their dynamic. They spoke in lower voices, seemed more cautious about their conversations, and would sometimes stop talking entirely when I approached their table to refill their coffee or check if they needed anything. My suspicions were first aroused when I overheard fragments of conversations that didn't seem to relate to legitimate trucking activities. During one visit, I heard them discussing packages that needed special handling, delivery schedules that had to be coordinated with specific individuals rather than businesses, and payments that were being made in cash rather than through normal shipping invoices. When I tried to listen more carefully to their conversations, they would notice my presence and immediately change the subject to mundane topics like weather conditions or truck maintenance. I began paying closer attention to their trucks when they were parked outside the restaurant. The Highway Brotherhood claimed to work for different shipping companies, but I noticed that their trailers often had similar modifications: additional locks, reinforced doors, and small ventilation systems that seemed unusual for standard cargo hauling. The trucks were always meticulously clean and well-maintained, but they had a uniformity that suggested they might be part of the same operation despite bearing different company logos. The breakthrough came when I recognized one of the drivers from a news report about missing children. The story was about a 12-year-old girl who had disappeared from a rest area about 200 miles from our truck stop. And the security footage showed her talking to a man who looked exactly like Tom Bradley, one of the Highway Brotherhood members. When I saw Tom during their next visit, I was certain it was the same person who had been caught on camera with the missing child. I started researching the routes and timing of the Highway Brotherhood's travels, comparing their schedule to reports of missing children along the interstate highways they claimed to travel. The correlation was horrifying. Children would disappear from rest areas, truck stops, and small towns within days of the Highway Brotherhood passing through those areas. The disappearances followed their route like a trail of destruction, with children vanishing every few hundred miles along the highways they traveled. I also discovered that Steve, the nervous driver who had supposedly quit trucking, was actually dead. His body had been found in a remote area off the highway about a month after his last visit to our truck stop. The official cause of death was listed as a single-vehicle accident. But the circumstances were suspicious enough that some investigators believed he might have been murdered. I realized that Steve had probably discovered what his fellow drivers were really doing and had either tried to leave the group or threatened to expose them. The most disturbing discovery came when I found missing children reports that included descriptions of a truck stop where the children had last been seen. Several of the missing children had been spotted at locations very similar to ours. 24-hour truck stops at highway intersections where they had supposedly been traveling with adult relatives who were never identified or located. The children would be seen eating at the restaurant, using the restroom facilities, or playing in the parking areas, and then they would disappear without any trace of where they had gone or who they had been traveling with. I realized that the Highway Brotherhood was using truck stops like ours as transfer points, where they could move children between different vehicles, change their appearance or clothing, and make it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track their movements. The children were being transported in the modified trailers I had observed, moved from one location to another as part of a sophisticated trafficking network that used the legitimate trucking industry as cover for their criminal activities. I knew I had to contact law enforcement, but I also knew that I needed to be extremely careful about how I handled the situation. The Highway Brotherhood had been visiting our truck stop for years, and they knew my schedule, my routines, and my personal information. If they suspected that I was onto them, they could easily make me disappear, just like they had done to Steve and countless children. I compiled all of my observations and documentation and contacted the FBI through their anonymous tip line, providing them with detailed information